Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? She stood there, tray in hand, coffee steaming, heart trembling. The oak table stretched like a runway between her and the men who believed they carried the weight of war. They leaned back in their chairs, shuffling folders, muttering acronyms, planning the kind of mission no one outside these walls would ever know. To them, she was invisible, a shadow with a paper cup, a servant in uniform. But when the pilot at the far end looked up, everything stopped. His eyes didn't search her face. They didn't linger on the coffee or the hesitation in her grip. No, his gaze froze on the patch stitched to her sleeve. The faded circle, the quiet, the one thing she should have left in a drawer. She felt his stare burn into it like a spotlight in the dark. The air shifted, conversation stuttered, chairs stopped creaking. That patch wasn't regulation. It wasn't even supposed to exist anymore. Her breath caught. She thought of her brother the moment she sewed it on. The way his laugh still haunted her dreams. The official letter that had reduced his life to 3 words, missing in action. She had clung to fabric because it was all she had left. A circle of thread. A memory stitched in silence. Now it had betrayed her. The pilot's jaw tightened. His throat worked around a word that refused to come. His hand, from years in the cockpit, gripped the folder as if it were the only anchor holding him steady. He knew. She saw it in his eyes, recognition, pain, and something else, fear. Her hand shook as she set the tray down. The steaming cup wobbled dangerously close to spilling. She prayed someone would laugh it off, call it nothing, let her slip back into invisibility. But no one moved. The room had gone still, waiting. "Where did you get that?" The pilot's voice cut through the air like steel against silence, calm but trembling beneath the surface. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wasn't supposed to speak here. She wasn't supposed to exist here. The mission brief was no place for a ghost sister. "It belonged to my brother," she whispered at last. "He wore it on his last deployment." The ripple that moved across the room wasn't curiosity anymore. It was weight. It was history pressing against the walls. Men who prided themselves on indifference suddenly couldn't look at her. Others stared too long. The pilot leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving her. A memory flickered across his face, too quick to name, too sharp to mistake. He knew her brother. And in that instant, she hated him for it. For years, all she had been given were reports, pages of sanitized words folded into official lies. Missing in action, presumed dead, no further details available. She had begged for answers. None came. Her nights had been filled with questions that bled into her bones. And here he was, a man with answers written in the lines of his face. Her knees weakened. She gripped the edge of the tray as though it might steady her. The pilot inhaled sharply, his voice low. "Your brother, he didn't just serve." A pause, a tightening in his chest. "He saved us all. I'm alive because of him." It was like the air itself collapsed around her. For years, silence had been her only companion. For years, grief had been something she carried alone. Now, in a single sentence, the truth cracked open, raw and merciless. Her brother hadn't vanished. He hadn't simply been lost in smoke and fire. He had chosen. He had stayed behind, shielded others, borne the flames so that others could return. The coffee cup nearly slipped from her hand. Heat licked her skin, but she didn't care. Tears welled, blurring her vision. Her throat burned with words that refused to come. She wanted to scream, to demand every detail, to curse him for surviving when her brother had not, to fall to her knees and finally let the grief tear through her. But she stood still, silent. And one by one, the men in the room rose to their feet. No clapping, no words, just the solemn scrape of chairs against the floor, a quiet honoring, a tide of respect that filled the room and threatened to drown her. She lowered her head, gripping her sleeve. That patch, her brother's memory, was no longer hidden. It was alive, it was seen. She had walked in as a girl carrying coffee. She was standing now as the sister of a hero. But even as pride stirred through the weight of sorrow, a shadow lingered in her mind. The pilot's eyes had said more than his words. A heaviness still hung there unsaid, something he hadn't told her, something he hadn't told anyone. Why? Why did his jaw clench when he looked at her? Why did his hand tremble when he spoke her brother's name? Her breath slowed. Because there was more to the story. And deep down she knew what came next would not be comfort, it would be truth, a truth that could break her or set her free. She turned to leave, but the silence followed, heavy, unfinished. The patch burned against her arm, as though her brother himself was whispering, "Don't stop here." The mission briefing resumed, voices carefully avoiding her, but she heard none of it. Her brother's ghost had just been pulled into the room, and she wasn't leaving until she knew why. She sat alone in the hallway, back against the cold wall, staring at the faded threads on her sleeve. Her heart pounded, her throat ached. For the first time in years, she wasn't just grieving. She was waiting. Because the pilot had recognized it. Because he had looked at her like he owed her something. Because there was still a story buried in smoke and fire. And she would not rest until she heard it. The corridor lights flickered overhead. The muffled sound of boots echoed down the hall. She knew someone was coming. She braced herself. It was Time, who was walking toward her in that empty corridor. The boots echoed, steady, deliberate, the sound of someone who had already decided what they were about to say. She wanted to run, to vanish back into the comfort of invisibility. But something in her gut, something as old as the grief stitched into her sleeve, kept her rooted. The pilot stepped out of the shadows. His shoulders looked heavier now, as if the truth had been sitting there all along, waiting for the right moment to break him open. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes drawn again to the patch on her sleeve, then lifting reluctantly to her face. "I shouldn't say anything," he began, voice low, rough from years of sand and smoke. "But I can't walk away either." Her chest tightened. The urge to shout at him surged up, hot and bitter. "Then why did you wait this long? Why didn't you tell me the second you saw me?" But she swallowed the words. Instead, she whispered, "You knew him." The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was memory. She could see it in his eyes, the flicker of firelight, the edge of a night sky cut by tracers, the weight of men's voices over failing comms. "I flew with him," the pilot finally said. "Not just once. Enough times to know what kind of man he was, and enough times to know how it ended." Her heart hammered. She leaned forward, "Tell me." But he shook his head, jaw locking. "Not here, not now." The refusal stung like betrayal. For years she had begged for scraps of truth, for anything more than government phrases polished until they meant nothing. Now the truth stood in front of her, alive, human, breathing, and it dared to retreat. "Then why stop me?" she snapped. "Why look at me like that if you weren't going to tell me?" The hallway swallowed her voice, bouncing it back to her ears. He didn't flinch. He only stood there, as if bracing against a wind she couldn't feel. "Because once you hear it," he said softly, "you can't it, and I don't know if you're ready for that." Her throat tightened. Rage, grief, desperation, they all collided at once. She wanted to scream that she had been ready since the night the letter came, that she had spent every year since carrying an absence like a wound, that she was already broken and nothing he could say could make it worse. But deep down she knew he was wrong. It could get worse. She saw it in his eyes, the guilt he carried. Guilt was never simple. It was heavy, layered, edged with shadows that didn't fade. He hadn't just witnessed her brother's final moments. He had lived through them, carried them, buried them. And guilt like that only came from one place. Survival. Her breath faltered. You lived because he didn't. He looked away as if the floor might swallow him whole. We all did. Her hands curled into fists. She wanted to hate him, to pin all the years of silence, of emptiness, of unanswered prayers onto his shoulders. but hatred felt too small compared to the enormity of loss. Instead, tears burned the corners of her eyes. "I need to know," she whispered, "all of it, every detail they kept from me." His gaze returned to hers, sharp, almost pleading. "It won't give you peace. It'll only change what you carry." Her voice cracked. "I already carry the weight of not knowing. Don't make me carry that forever." The words landed between them, raw and desperate. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he exhaled slowly, shoulders slumping. "Tomorrow, after the briefing, meet me." She wanted to demand more, wanted to tear the truth out of him right there in the hallway. But the finality in his tone left no room for argument. Tomorrow. It felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. As he turned to leave, she called after him, voice trembling. "Why me? Why tell me now?" He paused at the corner, glancing back. His expression was unreadable, but his words cut clear. "Because your brother made me promise. If I ever saw you, I'd tell you the truth." Her breath stopped. The hallway spun, the world tilting around that single sentence. Her brother, gone for years, had thought of her in his final moments, had left a message, a burden, a vow. And now the man who carried it was walking away. She slid down the wall, knees to her chest, as silence swallowed her again. Tomorrow. How could she survive the hours between now and then? Her mind reeled with images she couldn't control. Flames, gunfire, the imagined sound of her brother's last breath. She tried to push them away, but they clawed deeper, filling the cracks of every unanswered question. She closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against her knees. For so long, she had lived in a world where her grief was invisible, where people changed the subject, softened their eyes, whispered condolences that never filled the void. Now the void was cracking open, and she didn't know what she would find inside. The hours crawled. The night stretched endless. She lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, every tick of the clock dragging her closer to a truth she both craved and feared. Her fingers traced the edge of the patch, fabric worn thin from her grip. She wondered if her brother's hand had done the same before she ever touched it. She wondered what he thought in his final minutes. Did he regret staying behind? Did he wish for home, for family, for one last glimpse of daylight? Or had he chosen it freely, the way the pilot suggested, an act of defiance, of love, of unshakable duty? She whispered his name into the dark, as though the shadows themselves might carry it back to him. Sleep never came. By dawn her eyes burned. Her throat ached with the weight of silence. The pilot was waiting. He stood outside, arms folded, face unreadable in the pale morning light. He didn't ask if she was ready. He didn't offer comfort. He simply nodded, as though both of them already knew the truth was a storm that couldn't be stopped. Together they walked. Past the briefing room, past the hum of machinery and the scent of oil, past the guards who looked but didn't question, to a place where the echoes of war lingered. A small room, walls lined with old mission maps, corners cluttered with memories that weren't supposed to exist. He closed the door, the click of the lock final heavy. Her pulse raced, her hands trembled. He looked at her one last time, searching her face as though to make sure she truly wanted this. "You're about to hear what no one else has," he said quietly. "Not the brass, not the reports, just me and him." Her voice wavered, but her eyes held steady. "Tell me." He drew a long breath, shoulders bracing under the weight of memory. "It was supposed to be routine," he began, eyes unfocused, lost to the past. "But nothing about that night was routine. We were outnumbered, and your brother—" His voice cracked, falling into silence. She leaned forward, heart in her throat. "What did he do?" The pilot's gaze finally met hers, raw with guilt. "He stayed behind on purpose, and he made me swear I'd carry the truth to you, that I'd tell you why." Her breath froze. The room seemed to vanish, leaving only the weight of that promise pressing down on her. She wasn't ready. She would never be ready. But the story had begun, and there was no turning back. What really happened that night? The question hung between them like smoke, heavy and impossible to breathe. The small room felt smaller by the second, as though the walls themselves were bracing for the weight of memory. She sat rigid on the metal chair, her knuckles white against the edge of the table. The patch on her sleeve trembled with every pulse of her heartbeat. The pilot leaned back, his eyes fixed not on her but on the wall behind her, as though it had become a screen only he could see. His voice dropped to a near whisper. It started like every other op. Standard insertion. Clear the grid, secure the compound before dawn. Routine. But the way he said routine carried bitterness, as if mocking the very word. He shook his head slowly. There's no such thing, not really. That night proved it. She said nothing. She didn't want to break the fragile thread of truth finally unwinding. He drew in a long breath, eyes unfocused, lost in the storm of memory. The sky was clear, too clear. I remember thinking it felt wrong, like the air itself was waiting for something. Your brother sat across from me in the bird. He wasn't nervous. He never was. He had this look, calm, steady, like no matter what happened, he'd already accepted it. The kind of man you wanted next to you when things went bad. Her chest tightened. She could almost see it, her brother's face lit by the dull red glow inside the helicopter, his hand steady on his weapon, his eyes unreadable but certain. She had only photographs now, frozen smiles from before he left. But hearing the pilot's words painted him back into motion, breathing, alive. The pilot's hand trembled against the table. He gripped it into a fist to steady himself. We touched down. The compound was quiet, too quiet. You learn to hate that kind of silence. It never means safety. It means the storm hasn't broken yet. His gaze darkened, voice tightening. We breached, first 2 rooms clear, third room contact. Small arms fire, close quarters. We moved fast, faster than thought. Your brother was on point, always first through the door. Always. Her breath caught. She wanted to stop him, to slow it down, to tell him not to rush through the story like gunfire. Every word was a piece of her brother's last hours, and she wanted to hold each one like a relic. But the pilot pressed on, his eyes clouded with images only he could see. We pushed deeper. Radio chatter was thin, broken, something jammed comms. That's when we realized this wasn't a sweep. It was a trap. Her stomach nodded. They hit us hard. Corners, rooftops, crossfire, too many of them. We were boxed in. The kind of fight you don't win, only survive if luck decides to show up. We fell back into a courtyard. I'll never forget the sound. Rounds pinging off stone, shouting in languages I couldn't understand, the hiss of smoke, grenades burning the air. Chaos. His hands shook now, not from fear but from memory pressing into the present. He forced them still. Your brother, he didn't flinch. He took charge, not the ranking officer, but no one cared. In moments like that, you follow the one who doesn't break. And he didn't. He started barking orders, pulling men into cover, returning fire with precision. We were pinned, but he made it look like we still had a chance. She closed her eyes. She could almost hear it, the crash of gunfire, the thunder of boots against stone, her brother's voice rising above the chaos, steady, sharp, a lifeline in the storm. The pilot's voice faltered. We called for bird inbound, but too far. We had to hold, just had to hold. His throat worked as he swallowed hard. We didn't, not all of us. The silence that followed was jagged, cutting into her chest. She wanted to ask how many, who, but she already knew what he was circling around. Survival had a price. He stared at the floor, his words dropping like stones. We lost 2 men before we even made it back inside. 1 more in the stairwell. That sound, it doesn't leave you. The way a man falls when he knows he's not getting back up. Her nails dug into her palms. She hated him for saying it. She hated herself for needing to hear it. The pilot pressed his hands over his face, dragging them down slowly as though trying to wipe away ghosts. Your brother, he saw it, saw what was coming. He knew we wouldn't all make it if we tried to pull back as a unit, so he made a choice. Her breath stopped. He looked at her finally, eyes raw, voice breaking. He stayed, covered the rear, forced us forward. Every step we took out of that compound was because he was still inside, holding the line. The words struck her like a blade. Part of her had known it already, in the silence of official reports, in the way no one ever explained. But hearing it said aloud carved it into truth. He was still firing when we lifted off, the pilot whispered. I swear I heard him over the comms just for a second, calm, controlled, like he wasn't afraid, like he knew exactly what he was buying us. Her vision blurred with tears. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, trying to anchor herself against the flood. The pilot leaned forward, his hands clasped, voice trembling. We wanted to go back. God, we begged for it, but command said no, too hot, too late. We left him there, we left him. Her breath shuddered out of her chest. The words tore through her like shrapnel. We left him. She wanted to scream, to slam her fists against the table, to curse every man in that helicopter for not turning back. But her voice broke into nothing, swallowed by grief too vast to shape. The pilot's eyes burned with guilt. I see it every night. The muzzle flashes in the dark, the smoke swallowing him, the way the sound cut off sudden, and then nothing. Silence. It roared louder than any gunfire. She sat frozen, her heart torn between pride and rage. Pride that her brother had stood, unflinching, buying life with his own. Rage that they had left him, that the man across from her had lived while he had not. Her whisper was hoarse, trembling. You promised him, you said he made you promise. The pilot nodded, voice breaking. He grabbed me, before I ran, pulled me close. He said if you make it, you tell her. Tell her I didn't fall running, tell her I chose. Her hand flew to her mouth, as sobs ripped through her chest. He chose. Not abandoned, not lost, not erased by silence. He chose. The pilot's eyes glistened, his own voice cracking. He wanted you to know that, more than anything, that he stayed because it mattered, because you mattered. The tears came unstoppable, hot rivers down her face. Years of silence shattered into grief, into love, into unbearable weight. She pressed her forehead against her sleeve, against the patch, clutching it as though it could bring him back. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The room was filled only with the sound of her sobs and the ragged rhythm of the pilot's breathing. Finally, he whispered, courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like staying when you should run. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice no one else will ever see. She lifted her head slowly, eyes red, voice raw. And sometimes it looks like leaving someone behind. His gaze flinched, he couldn't answer. And in that silence she realized the truth wasn't simple. It never would be. Her brother's choice, their survival, the guilt that haunted them all, it was tangled, heavy, impossible to unravel into right and wrong. But one truth remained clear. Her brother hadn't disappeared into smoke. He had left a story, a choice, a promise. And now it was hers to carry. What do you do with a truth that cuts both ways? She sat frozen in the dim room, the pilot's words still echoing. Her brother hadn't fallen by accident. He hadn't been erased by chaos. He had chosen to stand, chosen to shield, chosen to stay. But behind that truth lurked another. We left him. The words rang like shrapnel. Her hands shook as she clutched her sleeve, the faded patch pressed tight against her chest. She wanted it to bring warmth, but all it carried now was fire, burning through her veins, scorching every thought. You left him, she whispered, voice raw. You left him there. The pilot didn't defend himself. His eyes were downcast, as though he'd already heard the verdict 1,000 times in his own head. We didn't have a choice, he said quietly. She snapped her head up, rage flashing. There's always a choice. The words cracked through the room like gunfire. Her breath trembled, her vision blurring. Tears streaked down her face, but they weren't soft this time. They burned. "You talk about courage," she continued, her voice shaking, "about sacrifice, but you flew away. You let him fight alone. You let him die alone." The pilot flinched, as if every word found its mark. He opened his mouth, closed it again, his silence louder than any excuse. Her hands balled into fists on the table. She wanted to hurt him with words, to bury him beneath the same unbearable weight she had carried for years. But as she stared at him, she saw something she hadn't expected. He was already buried. The guilt in his eyes was a wound that had never healed. Every night, every morning, every mission since, it had been there, eating him alive. For a moment, she hated that. She hated that grief had not been hers alone, that this man who lived still carried her brother like a ghost chained to his chest. And then slowly she hated it less. Because maybe that meant her brother wasn't entirely gone. Her breath faltered, a sob catching. She sank back in her chair, her anger collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. The tears came again, softer this time, as though they no longer belonged only to her. The pilot's voice was low, hoarse. "You think I don't replay it every night? That I don't hear his voice in my head telling me to run while he stayed? You think I don't wish, every damn day, that I'd ignored command, turned back, done something, anything?" He dragged his hand down his face, eyes closing tight. "I'm alive because he was, and there isn't a day I breathe that feels like I deserve it." The room went still. Her anger lingered, but it was tempered now, cooled by the recognition of something deeper, two wounds carved from the same moment. Hers born from absence, his born from survival. She whispered, "And yet he made you promise." The pilot's eyes opened slowly, meeting hers. Pain lived there, but so did something steadier, something almost defiant. "He wanted you to know the truth," he said. "Not the reports, not the silence, his choice, his dignity." The word stung. Dignity. She had spent years begging for scraps of truth, and now she was told she had to accept dignity instead of her brother's life. Her mind churned. What good was dignity when it came wrapped in silence and death? What good was choice when it left her empty, when it left her carrying a patch on her sleeve like an anchor tied to her soul? She stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. Her chest rose and fell, her breath ragged. "I can't," she stopped, shaking her head. "I can't just sit here with that. I need." Her voice broke. She didn't even know what she needed. Answers, justice, revenge, or just a way to breathe again. The pilot rose slowly, his movements heavy, deliberate. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't reach out. He only said, "You don't have to carry it alone." Her throat tightened. Alone. That word had defined her for so long, she barely knew how to imagine anything else. She turned to the door, unable to look at him anymore, unable to bear the sight of his grief mirroring her own. She pulled the handle, stepped into the hallway, and left the room without another word. The corridor stretched before her, sterile, lit by fluorescent lights that hummed too loud. Every step echoed, hollow, as though she were walking inside her own chest. She wanted the world to stop, to give her a moment to breathe, but it didn't. Officers still barked orders, radios still crackled with coded chatter, boots still struck the floor with practiced rhythm. Life went on. And her brother was still gone. She walked until the walls blurred and the noise faded, until she found herself outside under a pale sky. The air was cool, sharp, filled with the faint scent of oil and dust. She tilted her head back, staring at the emptiness above. Her brother had once stared at the same sky, she thought. Somewhere far from here, on nights before missions, he had looked at the stars and wondered if he'd see them again. She wondered if he had known the night would come when he wouldn't. A sob caught in her throat, but she bit it back. She had cried enough for one lifetime. Her hands gripped the patch again, fingers tracing its worn threads. Her brother had wanted her to know. That was his last thought, his final vow. But why? Why was it so important that she carried this truth? Her knees weakened and she sank onto a bench nearby, head bowed, eyes burning. The world spun around her, noise, duty, war, but she sat still, lost in questions too heavy to lift. For years she had lived with absence. Now she lived with truth, and she wasn't sure which was harder to bear. A shadow fell across her. She lifted her head. The pilot had followed. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He only stood there as though waiting for her to decide what came next. Her jaw clenched. "You said I don't have to carry it alone. Then carry it with me. Tell me everything, every detail. Don't stop until there's nothing left to say." His expression hardened, not in resistance but in resolve. "Then you'll hear it all," he said quietly. "But once you do, there's no going back." She nodded slowly, her breath unsteady. "There's no going back anyway." For a moment their eyes held. Two survivors of the same story, bound by a man who had chosen to stay. The pilot finally lowered himself onto the bench beside her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. He stared ahead, into the distance, into memories he had tried to bury. And as his voice began to unravel the rest of that night, she realized this was not just about her brother anymore. It was about every man who hadn't made it home, every silence carried by families left behind, every truth swallowed by reports that erased the human weight of war. Her brother's story was one of many, but to her it was everything. And she would not let it vanish again. What does a man think about when he knows he's not coming back? The question burned in her chest as the pilot leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice caught between confession and memory. The morning air was cold, sharp against their skin, but the weight of what he carried was heavier than weather. "He knew," the pilot said finally. "From the moment we got boxed in, he knew, maybe before that. I think that's what set him apart. The rest of us fought to survive. He fought to give survival away." She stayed silent, afraid that if she spoke, the fragile thread of his memory would snap. The pilot's eyes drifted, unfocused, as though the compound had risen again before him. "We were low on ammo. Every magazine we dropped clattered like a clock running out of time. Men shouted for cover, for bearings, for answers. And your brother, he was steady. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. He was precise, calm." Her throat tightened. Calm, that was the word she had heard in every letter, every story his friends told. Her brother wasn't the kind who bragged. He wasn't the kind who raised his voice. He was the kind who made silence feel like safety. The pilot's voice dropped lower. "I caught him once just for a second between volleys. He wasn't aiming. He wasn't firing. He was looking down at his pocket." She frowned. "His pocket." He nodded slowly, pulled out a picture, folded at the edges, smudged from sweat and sand. He looked at it for a heartbeat, then tucked it back, chambered his next round, and kept firing. Her breath caught. She didn't have to ask what picture it was. She knew. It had been taken at a picnic years ago. Just her, younger, with messy hair and grass stains on her knees, smiling in a way she hadn't since. That photo had sat on his nightstand before he left. She thought it was lost. Tears blurred her vision. The pilot's voice faltered. "That's who he was. In the middle of fire, in the middle of hell, he thought about you, about home, and it made him stronger, not weaker." Her hand rose to her sleeve, gripping the patch so hard her knuckles ached. The pilot continued, his tone shifting, raw, almost reverent. "We had maybe 10 minutes before the bird arrived. 10 minutes felt like forever. Every second stretched. We were running dry. I saw it in the men's eyes. We weren't going to hold." His jaw clenched, the memory tearing into him. That's when he moved, not waiting for permission, not asking. He stood, shifted into position, and drew the fire, all of it, like he wanted it. Her chest squeezed. "Why?" The pilot's gaze flickered to her, then back to the horizon. "Because it gave us room. Every muzzle pointed at him meant one less pointed at us. He didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He made himself the storm so we could slip through." The image struck her like lightning. Her brother standing in the chaos, fire bursting around him, steady as a mountain while others slipped away under his cover. The pilot swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I yelled for him to move, to fall back. He just shook his head, and then he smiled. She froze, smiled. He nodded, his eyes glassy, like he'd already made peace with it, like he was telling me this is mine, don't take it from me. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and unrelenting. Her brother had smiled in his last moments, not from ignorance, not from recklessness, but from choice, from acceptance. The pilot's voice broke. I've carried that smile every day since, because it wasn't despair, it wasn't fear, it was freedom. He chose to be the one who stayed, and none of us could take that from him. Her sob caught in her throat, a sound torn between pride and agony. The pilot pressed his palms together, bowing his head. We pulled out. I'll never forget the sound of the bird's rotors as we lifted, drowning out the gunfire, but not enough to hide it completely. I could still hear him firing, still hear his voice over the comms, calm, steady, and then silence. Her whole body trembled, that word again. Silence. It had followed her for years, filled her nights, sat beside her in every empty room, but now the silence had a face, a moment. And it was unbearable. The pilot lifted his head slowly, his eyes wet. I wanted to go back. God knows I did, but command. She cut him off sharply. Don't say command again. Don't hide behind orders. He flinched but nodded. You're right, I could tried, I didn't, and I'll live with that. The admission hung heavy in the air. She leaned back, wiping tears with the back of her sleeve, her breath ragged. So that's it. That's the story. He stayed, you left, and I'm supposed to just, what? Wear this patch and be proud. Her voice cracked on the last word, pride. It felt hollow when spoken through grief. The pilot's tone softened. You asked what he did, I told you, but that's not the end. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? His eyes narrowed as though weighing whether to continue. There were reports from locals, from signals we intercepted later, whispers that he wasn't finished when we thought, that he held longer than anyone believed possible. Her heart stumbled. You mean? I mean no one knows exactly how long he lasted. Could been minutes, could been hours, but what matters is this. His stand wasn't just for us. It slowed them down, long enough that the rest of our unit regrouped, long enough that an entire village nearby walked away instead of being slaughtered. Her lips parted. A village. The pilot nodded, voice quiet. They never knew his name. They never saw his face. But their children are alive because your brother refused to move. The words struck her like a tidal wave. For years she had pictured his last stand as a lonely act, swallowed by dust and fire. Now, to hear it had rippled outward, saving not just his squad but families who would never even know him. It was too much. She pressed both hands to her face, sobs breaking loose, unstoppable. The pilot's voice carried a rough edge of reverence. That's who he was, not just a soldier, not just your brother. He was a shield for all of us. She shook her head, choking through tears. And still he was alone. The pilot hesitated, then said quietly, no, not alone, not really. Because we're still here carrying him, you, me, everyone who walked out because of him. He lives in that. Her shoulders shook as she lowered her hands, eyes red, voice a whisper. It's not enough. He nodded slowly. It never is, that's the truth of it. Silence fell between them, but it was different now. Not the silence of reports and missing in action letters. Not the silence of unanswered questions. This silence was shared, heavy with memory, but alive. She gripped the patch, her chest aching. She had wanted details. Now she had them, and they left her both shattered and whole, broken and proud. For the first time in years, she wasn't just grieving a mystery. She was grieving a man. Her brother. And somehow, that felt closer than she had ever imagined she would be again. What do you do with a story once it's no longer buried? That question haunted her as the day stretched into night. The pilot's voice, the fragments of memory, her brother's smile in his final moments, they all replayed in her head like broken reels of film, looping endlessly until she couldn't breathe. She sat alone in her quarters, the patch on her sleeve pressed to her chest. For years it had been a secret comfort, a private memorial only she understood. Now it felt heavier, as though the threads themselves carried his last words. "Tell her I chose." The weight was unbearable. She thought of the pilot, the way his voice cracked when he admitted he'd left, the guilt that lived in his eyes like a shadow. Part of her wanted to hate him, to pour all her anger into his survival. But another part, the quieter, deeper part, saw him differently now. He had carried the truth for years. He had lived with the ghost she thought belonged only to her. He had honored the promise her brother had made him swear to keep. And in some twisted way, that made him family. Her hands trembled as she pulled open her drawer. Inside was a journal, battered and nearly full, pages written in ink that had bled with tears. She had started it after the letter came, filling it with questions, with grief, with prayers whispered to a man who would never answer. But tonight her pen moved differently. He smiled. She stopped, staring at the words. 3 small words, but they carried more than years of silence ever could. He smiled when he stayed. He thought of me. He wasn't afraid. The ink blurred as tears fell, but she didn't stop. She wrote until her wrist ached, until the page was covered in the story the pilot had given her. She wrote not because it lessened the grief, but because it gave the grief shape. Her brother was no longer a headline. He was a man again. When she finally closed the journal, her body shook with exhaustion. But beneath the exhaustion was something else. Resolve. Her brother had chosen to stay, to shield, to make his life a wall between chaos and the people behind him. If she let that story fade, if she let it die in silence, then his choice would vanish too. She couldn't let that happen. The next morning she found the pilot waiting outside the hangar. He looked older than he had the day before, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. But when he saw her, he straightened slightly, as though bracing for what she might demand. She didn't waste time. "I need to know more, not just about that night, about him, the man you flew with, the man you knew." He studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, but it won't be easy. Stories like his, they're not kept in files, they're kept in people, and most of those people don't talk." "Then we'll make them," she said firmly. Something flickered in his eyes, respect, maybe even relief. For years he had carried the weight alone. Now finally someone else was willing to shoulder it. They walked together through the base, past officers who glanced curiously at her but said nothing. The patch on her sleeve was no longer invisible. It drew eyes, whispers, quiet recognition. She had feared that. Now she welcomed it. The pilot led her to the motor pool, where an older mechanic worked with grease-stained hands. The man looked up, eyes narrowing, then freezing when they landed on her sleeve. His expression shifted, curiosity, recognition, then sorrow. "You're his sister," the mechanic said softly, as though speaking a sacred truth. Her chest tightened. "You knew him." The man nodded slowly. "We all did. Not in the way you think, not in medals or promotions, but in small ways. The way he always checked on the youngest in the unit. The way he fixed radios when no one else could. The way he never took the last cigarette, even when he wanted it." Her throat closed. These weren't battlefield stories. They were human ones. Pieces of her brother she had never known, hidden in the cracks between missions. The mechanic's voice grew rough. "I was there when he patched up a rookie who froze during a firefight. Didn't yell at him. Didn't shame him. Just sat with him after, shared his rations, told him the fear would pass. That kid made it home because of him. Married now, 3 kids, never forgot." Tears burned her eyes. The stories poured in, unasked but unstoppable. Men she barely knew stopped her in hallways, lowering their voices, sharing fragments. A laugh over cold rations. A steadying hand in turbulence. A look that said, "I've got you," when words weren't enough. Every story was small, but together they built a mosaic. Her brother wasn't just a man who died in a compound. He was a man who lived fully, quietly, fiercely until the last moment. And as the stories grew, so did something inside her. Pride, yes, but more than that, responsibility. She realized now why he had made the pilot promise. Not just so she would know he had chosen, but so she would carry it forward. Her brother hadn't lived for himself. He had lived for others, shielded others, given his life for others. And now she thought it was her turn. That night she sat with the pilot again, this time not in sorrow but in purpose. "I don't want his story whispered in hallways," she said firmly. "I don't want it to die in reports that mean nothing. People need to know, not just me." The pilot studied her, his jaw tightening. "You're talking about something bigger, public, that won't be easy. Command doesn't like stories like his told. They like control, silence." "I don't care what Command likes," she said, her voice steady. "He earned more than silence." The pilot's eyes softened with something that looked almost like admiration. "You've got his fire." Her heart ached, but she held his gaze. "No, I've got his story, and I won't let it die." The pilot leaned back, exhaling. "Then we'll start, but know this, it'll cost you. Truth always does." She nodded slowly, so did his choice. Silence lingered, but it wasn't empty. It was a pact, a vow formed not of orders or duty, but of shared grief and shared resolve. As she walked back to her quarters, the night air wrapped around her like a shroud. She lifted her hand, brushing the patch once more. For years it had been a relic. Now it was a mission. Her brother had stayed. Now she would carry him forward, whatever it cost. What happens when the truth doesn't fit the story they want told? She learned the answer the moment she spoke her brother's name, outside the safety of whispers. At first it was small, a pause in conversation when she mentioned him, a look exchanged between officers, sharp and cautious. The way voices lowered when she walked into a room. They weren't ignoring her anymore. They were watching, measuring. The pilot had warned her. Command doesn't like stories like his told. She hadn't understood the weight of that until now. Her brother's sacrifice wasn't just a memory, it was a liability. The next briefing she sat in the back, not with a tray of coffee but with a notebook. She didn't hide the patch. She let it catch the light, let the silence it brought settle like a challenge. When the colonel glanced her way, his eyes lingered too long, cold as glass. Afterward she was summoned. The office was sterile, the walls lined with commendations and flags. The colonel didn't look at her as he shuffled papers. He spoke flatly, his voice polished with the kind of authority that erased questions. "We appreciate your service here, but I need to remind you, operational details are classified. What happened on that mission stays sealed. Do you understand?" Her pulse quickened, but she forced her voice steady. "I understand classification, but I also understand silence is an honor." His eyes flicked up sharp. "This isn't about honor, it's about order. Stories like the one you're chasing, they unravel discipline. They invite doubt, and doubt kills soldiers." She clenched her fists at her sides. Or maybe stories like his remind them what they're fighting for. The colonel leaned forward, his gaze hard. "You think you're helping. You're not. You're opening wounds. You're stirring ghosts better left buried." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "He wasn't a ghost. He was my brother, and he deserves more than a line in a report." Silence stretched. The colonel's jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. He simply leaned back, dismissing her with a glance toward the door. "This conversation is over." But it was not for her. She walked out with her chest burning, anger and grief colliding until she could barely breathe. They wanted her quiet. They wanted her brother forgotten. And for the first time, she realized the fight ahead wasn't just against memory. It was against the very institution that had sworn to honor him. That night she sat with the pilot again. He listened in silence as she told him about the colonel, about the warning, about the walls closing in. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. I told you, truth costs. They don't want it because it doesn't fit the script. Heroes are clean, sacrifice is neat. But the real thing is messy, painful. It asks questions they don't want asked. She pressed her palms into her knees, her voice trembling. Then what do I do? Stay quiet. Pretend this patch is just fabric. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, What do you think he'd want? The question struck deeper than any order ever could. What would her brother want? Silence to protect the machine, or truth to honor the man? She already knew the answer. The following days blurred into a quiet war. She sought out men who had served with her brother, pressing for stories, writing them down in her journal. Some resisted, afraid of consequences. Others spoke easily, relief flickering in their eyes as if they'd been waiting years for someone to ask. Piece by piece, she built a picture not of a flawless soldier, but of a man who chose again and again to put others first. A man who had flaws, fears, humor, humanity, and whose final act was not an accident but a decision. But the more she gathered, the more the whispers grew, officers watching, files locked, conversations cut short when she entered. One evening, she returned to her quarters to find her journal missing, the drawer empty, the space where it had been hollow. Her breath stopped. She tore through the room, every corner, every shadow. Nothing. Her legs gave way and she collapsed onto the bunk, hands trembling. The journal had been her anchor, her proof, her brother's story in ink. Gone. The door creaked. She looked up to see the pilot standing there, his expression grim. They took it, he said quietly. Her voice broke. Why erase him again? He sat beside her, his hand gripping hers firmly. Because stories like his remind people of choice, and choice scares them. Her tears blurred the room. Then what's left? If they erase him again, what's left? The pilot squeezed her hand. You're left, that patch, that memory, that promise. They can take paper, but they can't take what he gave you. She shook her head, sobbing. It's not enough. He looked at her steadily. Then make it enough, speak it, live it, don't wait for permission. The words struck something deep inside her. For so long, she had begged for scraps from the system. Now she saw it clearly. The system would never give her what she needed. Her brother hadn't asked permission to stay. He had chosen. Now it was her turn. The next morning she stood in the mess hall, the patch visible on her sleeve. The room quieted, eyes turning. She didn't raise her voice, but her words carried. My brother didn't vanish. He stayed. He chose. And you're here because of him. The silence that followed wasn't dismissal. It was weight. Some men looked down, others straight ahead. But in their eyes she saw it, the spark of recognition, the unspoken respect. Command couldn't erase that. Her brother's story had begun to live again. But she knew this was only the beginning. The real test wasn't whether she could tell his story. It was whether she could live it. And deep down, she feared what that might cost. How do you carry a legacy you never asked for? That question followed her everywhere now. In the hallways, in the empty bunks, in the quiet moments when she pressed her sleeve to her chest. For years, she had carried silence. Now she carried truth, and it weighed more than she could have imagined. The whispers on base grew louder, not the dismissive kind she had once endured, but murmurs of recognition. Men nodded when she passed, their eyes flickering to the patch, their silence no longer ignorance but respect. She hadn't spoken much, but she didn't need to. The story was spreading, carried not by reports or files but by people. Her brother had become more than a name. He had become a reminder. But reminders come at a cost. The colonel called her in again. His voice was sharp this time, stripped of polish. You're walking a dangerous line. This crusade of yours, it ends now. Do you understand? She held his gaze. No, sir, I don't. His jaw clenched. You think you're honoring him. What you're doing is undermining order. Soldiers don't need stories about impossible choices. They need certainty. Her voice was calm but steady as steel. Certainty is a lie. My brother didn't die for a lie. He died for people, and they deserve to know. The colonel's eyes hardened, but he said nothing. Just waved her away, as though swatting at a storm he couldn't stop. She walked out with her head high. That night the pilot found her by the hangar, staring at the stars. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, their silence shared like it had been from the beginning. Finally he said, "You've done what I couldn't. I carried the truth like a weight. You're carrying it like a flame." She turned to him, eyes wet but steady. "And a flame can spread. That's what scares them." He nodded slowly. "So what now?" She looked back at the sky, at the endless dark her brother had once flown through. "Now I live the way he did. Not for orders, not for silence, for people, for something bigger than myself." The pilot's expression softened, almost a smile, though shadowed by years of guilt. He'd be proud. Her throat tightened. He already was. He chose to stay because he believed in us, in me. For a long moment they stood in quiet reverence. The stars above, the hum of the bass behind them, the weight of memory between them. In the days that followed, she didn't shout her brother's story. She didn't plaster it on walls or write it in reports. She lived it. She stood up when others stayed silent. She listened when the overlooked were ignored. She carried herself not as a shadow, but as someone who had seen what courage cost and what it gave. And the others noticed. Young recruits came to her quietly at first, then more openly, asking about the patch, about the man behind it. She told them, not with grandeur, not with embellishment, but with honesty. A man who smiled in the fire. A man who stayed so others could live. A man who carried his family in his pocket to the very end. Each time she spoke, the truth grew lighter. Not because the grief faded, it never did, but because it no longer lived only in her. The pilot stood with her through it all. Sometimes he spoke, adding fragments of memory. Other times he simply stood in the back, eyes lowered, letting her voice carry what he could not. His guilt didn't vanish, but it softened, transformed into something closer to purpose. Together, they turned silence into story. And slowly, story became legacy. One evening, months later, she found herself walking past the memorial wall. Names etched in stone, cold and final. Her brother was there, carved neatly among hundreds. She reached out, fingers tracing the letters. For years, this wall had been her only proof he had lived. A name, a line, a silence. But now she knew better. He wasn't stone, he wasn't silence, he was flame. The patch on her sleeve caught the fading light of dusk, glowing faintly as though it carried embers. She pressed it gently, whispering into the evening air. "I'll keep carrying you, not as loss, as choice." Her voice trembled, but her heart was steady. Because she finally understood. Her brother's sacrifice wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of hers. She walked away from the wall, not with the weight of grief alone, but with the quiet strength of resolve. She didn't need medals or reports to prove who he was. She would live it, in how she carried herself, in how she carried others, in how she refused to let silence win. And in that his choice lived on. The pilot's words echoed in her mind. "You're carrying it like a flame." Yes, a flame, fragile, costly, but alive. And flames, once lit, don't vanish, they spread. Sometimes quietly, sometimes unseen, but always forward. As she stepped into the night, the patch warm beneath her hand, she felt him there. Not behind her, not gone, but beside her. Her brother. Her shield. Her story. And in that moment, she finally understood the lesson he had left behind. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.